Hi, everybody. We are back again with a Cycle Smart weekly meeting podcast recording. We have a weekly coaches meeting with all the Cycle Smart coaches. And on those meetings, we often realize that there's lots of gems that come up just in our internal weekly meetings. And we've been talking for a long time about trying to record some of those meetings to share some of those gems with you. So this is our second attempt at that. You can find it in podcast form on our Solutions for Cycling podcast. And that's, as folks say, all the places you find your podcast, but we'll also put it on the Cycle Smart YouTube channel and you can look for it there. And so today's topic is going to be about testing, which might sound a little dry and a little boring, but there's actually a lot to talk about. And I think you'll find we have a lot of strong opinions about what we like and don't like. And I think insights that are unique to CycleSmart and our coaches and our approach that might be different advice than you will get elsewhere, or different emphasis on what we find important compared to maybe other folks' approaches. To talk about that today, we have Jordan Villella, Alec Donahue, Michael Vandenham, and Austin Killips. And I am Adam Myerson. Yeah, good. We ready? Is that it? We ready to dive in?
Think so.
Yes.
We're going to talk today about like all the ways to test and why you would utilize any of those approaches, and approaches we used in the past and have abandoned, and why. But I think we've decided that those are important to talk about because we want to talk about the history of testing and how we got to where we are today. We'll talk about zones based on percentage of threshold versus metabolism-based zones, metabolic zones, and how they differ. We'll talk about all of the critical points: anaerobic threshold, maximal lactate steady state, onset of blood lactate accumulation, LT1, LT2. There's so many different things that you are trying to pinpoint. So we'll try to talk about all those. We'll talk about FTP and essentially why we don't like it and why we don't use it and why it's a term that we avoid. I think that will be interesting for folks. We're going to talk about critical power, monod and shear, why we really like that approach and why it's been useful for us over the past 25 years now at this point that the company's existed, and how long we've been coaching. We'll talk about the inside test, INSCYD, and how we've come to use that in recent years and what we've learned from that. Ultimately, we're going to talk about perceived exertion and how PE is king, and how your ego is one of the most important things that you can control when you're testing, especially if you understand why you're testing. So that's the summary, and we'll dive right in. So I think first, when people think about testing, they probably think about lab testing. I think there's this idea that you go someplace to do some physiological testing.
The word test scares people every time, no matter what it is. It's as soon as I mention a test, people want to, I got this going on and I got that going on, and it's so different,
Absolutely. I've started calling them power check-ins.
That's
We want
a
to see
great
where you're
Yeah,
at.
great.
Let's adjust things to make sure that we're doing the right stuff.
That's a
This is
great
not
idea.
a test.
Yeah. Well,
I say you cannot fail a power test.
that's
Which
right.
I
Well,
like.
hold that thought, because that's really important. I think we're already getting ahead of ourselves with that because that's critical. But I think the first thing we want to talk about is like actual lab testing and why it's useful, why we do or don't do it. I think we all have this image of someone with a expired gases mask on a trainer in a lab.
Lab coats everywhere. That's what I think.
Yeah, whether they're measuring power or lactate.
Or both.
Why do we think lab testing is useful?
Up until recently, the resolution we got outside the lab was questionable. So we didn't have and now like a lot of devices are questionable. So there is more junk data currently, but in the past, it was the only very accurate data we could get, even if it skewed the results because you're riding your bike in a room and sometimes not even your own bike.
Yeah, but we weren't able to measure power outside. We weren't able to measure lactate outside. We weren't able to measure expired gases outside. And so you had to go somewhere to do that. And now we can measure all those things in the field.
When I think of lab testing, I think of, you're paying or something, someone is making sure this is 100% accurate. That's what I think of lab testing. It is accurate. And
Yeah.
that's the kind of notion that I've had for a while with it. That's when I think of it, but now it's changed.
And one of the real problems with lab testing is it may be the most accurate, but like Al said, you're in a different environment than you normally would be. And I would say as a coaching group, we coach a lot of people who they have a really finite amount of time in which they can do things. And maybe taking an afternoon and spending hundreds of dollars to go to the lab, that's eating into other real training time or lifetime.
Yeah,
And we just kind of want to balance that. If you can accomplish something that's very, very close to that in the field and it takes a quarter of the amount of time and doesn't cost you nearly as much money, that's something, you need to explore, which is probably why why field testing kind of came out to be a thing in the first place.
Well, and I think when we say accurate, we want to talk about what part of it is accurate, because I think we've all agreed, and we should say it out loud here, like what's not accurate in lab testing is power at any of the things that you're measuring. So it may be accurate for measuring expired gases and lactate, or even heart rate response. What it's not accurate at measuring is power output of those things. And why is that the case? Well, we all know from our own experience the difference between training indoors and outdoors. As one example, everybody's experienced their power being lower on the trainer than it is outside. Well, now
especially if you're not on your bike,
right, as Al mentioned, like you may not be on your own bike in a lab, you may be on some kind of ergometer. So yeah, it's accurate in those taking those measurements. Power is not one of them. We know that power is going to be reduced. And the problem there is, let's say people determine their onset of blood lactate accumulation in the lab. The power that happens at is clearly going to be lower measured inside the lab as it would be in a field test outside. Well, so let's segue into field testing. We certainly rely on field testing almost exclusively now. And of course, we have a number of different types of field tests, but what are the benefits? Why do we like field testing?
Yeah,
Personally,
all the
go ahead,
reasons we
sorry.
kind of alluded to is it
Yeah.
actually represents the environment that you compete in if you're racing, right? It doesn't matter what your power is in the lab. You're never racing in the lab unless you're doing
Well,
Swift, I guess.
yeah, that's
Um,
almost true. Yeah,
Tell the
right.
Zwifters
Yeah,
that.
Zwift means you're racing in the lab, but yeah, no, point taken. But yeah, I mean, for someone who is competing on Zwift, it may be important. I mean, we'll get to this, but it's important to note that like testing should happen in the environment that your training and racing is going to happen in. And
Yeah.
these days, for some people, that may mean, and at certain times of the year, that may mean testing indoors. So we'll get to that. It's a funny, we can back ourselves into a corner there if we forget. Yeah.
I
yeah, I
like
guess. Go
I
ahead,
was gonna
go
say
ahead.
I like outdoor testing and testing in the field just because they're on their own equipment. I usually have them test on a race setup, what they're used to riding, the bike they're training on, whether it's someone who's usually training on their road bike, but they're planning on racing mountain bikes, move them over to that bike to do the testing and then the rest of their training. So yeah, field testing is way more practical and they can do it at their own kind of pace.
Yeah. And then I think,
I think
oh, go ahead, Mike.
I think the other benefit of field testing is not everybody races 20 or 30 times a year. You can very much use it as a preparatory dry run for a race. Like you want to figure out your nutrition, you want to figure out your race prep, your mentality. You can actually use testing as a chance to experiment with that and see that what you're doing is going to work.
Yeah, we say all the time that training is testing, and we'll talk about that later, like what we can learn from training to help determine zones. But it is also true that testing is training. I don't think we say that as often, but sometimes you can include the testing in such a way that simply doing the testing is it's an effective training day or effective couple of training days if you put them in the right spot. I think when we talk about field testing, I think there's a lot of different ways to do it. And I think what's most popular and probably what we like least is the 20-minute power test. And then a percentage of 20-minute power determine threshold. I guess let's talk about what's good and bad about that approach. Why do we like it? Or what are the
It's
nice
easy.
things? Yeah, what are the nice
Yeah,
things we can say about that? Yeah.
I mean, it's easy. So like if you don't have a lot of, buy-in from an athlete or they don't want to get too in depth with their physiology, it's something that you can do repeatedly and it's a low cost of entry. But it's also low yield in information metabolically.
Can you expand on that for a second? We're going to get into that in big detail later, but I think what you just said is a really big point and merits a little more
This is
explanation.
a large can of worms, but like I
Yeah,
have no idea how somebody is making that power
that's what I
and
wanted.
what do they have above that and like where do they, in the process getting to that 20-minute power, like what's happening below that as well. And like all those processes are not tied to a percentage of that 20-minute effort. And it varies. Like on average, you can throw some percentages, but like I don't like to work on average. I have a higher standard of quality for my work. So I want to know what the individual is experiencing. I want to understand the fingerprint of how this person makes power and what levers I can pull on to enhance their performance, not be like, oh, on average, you're gonna get this if we do these random numbers.
Yeah,
And
because
we have
especially,
seen,
sorry, Mike, let me get this thought
yeah,
out. Because even if you can take an athlete and learn enough about them to say, hey, if the average is 95% of 20 minutes for most people, you're 97 or 92, and that gives us a consistent number. We know that even within an individual athlete, that percentage changes as the shape of their fitness changes. If we've improved their anaerobic work capacity or anaerobic systems and they're making more 5-minute power, then that's going to be a bigger contribution to the 20-minute power and skews that. And so I think those are all great explanations for it's not useless, but it is certainly not our preference. And
yeah,
Mike, I'm sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
no, that's actually very similar to what I was going to say. Is we've seen such a wide range from different athletes, and even the same athlete where you are in the season, what percentage of that 20-minute is what your threshold will be measured at. And then there's also the problem that if you're going that way, you might be taking a percentage and then taking a percentage of that percentage. So you're kind of getting decreasing accuracy there when you start doing percentage based zones as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
My biggest problem with it is I end up having a hard time finding where to do these, or my athletes have a hard time finding where to perform these tests at, you know? And I know with other tests, you can find, kind of more suitable terrain, but 20 minutes all out going, if you're not, on a track or, at the Oval for us in Pittsburgh, like it's really hard to find something that doesn't have climbs and descents, and then it just comes back to accuracy, but it's still a pain.
Yeah, I mean, it ends up throwing you back onto the trainer and brings us back to what we were talking about with lab testing. But in terms of positive things to say and glean from the 20-minute test, I mean, I think there is a process element to it that's incredibly valuable. Mike was talking about athletes that don't race a whole lot in the season. The 20-minute test can be a way to almost get the jitters out of of the first race of the season, or and I think it also is a really, really helpful reference point for fleshing out that sense of perceived exertion. I think if you're, in touch with yourself and sort of monitoring how deep you're going, you can really start to develop like, okay, this is what it means to be fully on the limit. And that is valuable data personally as an athlete, I think.
Yeah, that's
Pacing
right.
for sure.
You don't get that in a 12-minute test or shorter. I think like that kind of understanding of perceived exertion really happens in that like the last 8 minutes of a 20-minute effort where you really know like, did you pace this right? Can you turn it up? Do you have to turn it down? Do you have to stop? So even in
And that's
training,
why
yeah.
I like including the 20-minute in a battery of tests. It's not the end all be all, but like
Mhm.
that people get very scared of the 20 and they like crack mentally, which parallels to what they do in races. So if you get good at 20s, there's a lot of coaching that comes out of a good 20-minute effort. But I think we need more context in that singular effort.
Well, and
Yeah.
that's a
Yeah,
great way to lead us into talking about critical power and Monod and Shear and why we like a test that we like to use is a 5-minute and a 20-minute test and how we learn so much more from a critical power test. So the test we use at CycleSmart is based on Monod and Shear, and basically we've created a spreadsheet that does a little bit of math for us where we don't just have someone do a 20-minute test and take 95% of it. We have them do a 20-minute test and also a 5-minute test. So that means we don't have to guess at what anaerobic contribution is happening in a 20-minute test. We can measure it. And by measuring it and plotting those against each other as outlined in Monin and Shearer, which is, as we were talking before the call, 1965, it's well documented and robust and tested and has proven to still be reliable with some caveats. Adding that 5-minute test in, while maybe doesn't help you with your neuromuscular power measurement or taking that into consideration, anything like 3 minutes and on, and for the purpose of just setting accurate threshold power numbers as your basic standard, the 5 and 20-minute tests just do an infinitely better job than a 20-minute test plus some percentage that you're guessing at. We don't have to guess, we can measure it. For something that I think is so important, that's probably like, there's the summary, right? I don't know if you all have anything to add on that. Like,
No, it's pretty concise.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, if you're limited to pulling your test data from power files, I think we found that that's the best way to do it. But maybe this is getting ahead of ourselves. We've also, in more recent years, found better ways that you can pull power data from test files as well that give a little bit more of a complete picture.
Yeah. And I think that leads us into two things. Talking about lactate and measuring lactate in the field as a thing that it's certainly not a new concept. It's not a thing that we only just started being able to do. But I think is maybe just getting a little easier to do in the field because there are more widely available devices and people have a better understanding of it.
Yeah, you're seeing athletes do it more and more, in social media, even in the Netflix documentary. Van der Poel is like, he's over on the side and he's like, huddled over from going so hard, and his coach comes over and just pricks him, gets that little blood out and, tests it. And it's, as a coach, I'll admit it's very intimidating, to see that, to do those things, but it's accurate and it's blood, it's data,
Well, and it has to have a protocol behind it, right? You have to actually know what
100%.
you're doing. You can't just go out and ride around and, actually, I take that back. You can just go out and ride around and measure your blood. That is a thing. Yeah.
Those strips are expensive though. You got to know what you're doing.
But I mean, you can go around and ride at what you believe to be zone 2 and figure out like, hey, what lactate level is 2 millimoles per milliliter. What is the power that I ride to get to that steady state? I think
it doesn't lie. That's the thing.
When provided you are doing a good job with your test strips and stuff, right?
Calibrated, yeah, for sure.
But you mentioned Van der Poel and in the video, and I think what's important there too is we know what Van der Poel was doing in that video. He was doing an inside test, and 100%. An inside test has a power-based field test, but also a lactate-based field test, and you can take two approaches. And so I'll introduce the inside test as the next thing for us to talk about, because for us, that has become the gold standard for us. It's not practical for everybody, and maybe it's more information than some athletes are ready to absorb. Maybe have other things that they can control first that we should focus on. But when an athlete reaches a certain level where they're doing the work and they're controlling what they can control, the inside test, and again, it's INSCYD, inside, has really been a game changer for us. And so I'll put it out there to all of you. Like, I mean, Austin, you've done so many inside tests for me. You are so experienced with it, but so has Mike and Jordan, myself, and Al within the company has implemented the largest number of inside tests and probably has the best understanding of the broad swath of results that we can get. But what have we learned? This is a big topic. What have we learned from inside? Why do we like it so much?
Oh, that is a big topic. But
well, I think I got into lactate 20 years ago, and I was mainly focusing on 2 millimole through max lactate steady state, because that's kind of what, we didn't have great ways of really determining those zones. I knew that there was glycolysis happening above threshold, but I wasn't sure of the interplay between aerobic and glycolytic function. But Sebastian really brought that in where like I could measure like your peak lactate values, but like combustion of lactate and its role in, in metabolism throughout intensity spectrum, that's what he really was able to help us with, and how we can understand, like, based on what intensity we're riding at, what levers we're pulling on, and what improvements we can expect to see in fitness, and through the interrelated aspects of glycolytic fitness.
Yeah, and
So it kind of, yeah, it broke down that like there isn't a monolith of like you make power, you're just this engine. There are processes that turn off, ramp up and down based on how hard you're going. And that's very individualized per rider, and even like based on their current nutrition. So it showed there's like it's a lot more complexity, but it gave us actionable work to do with athletes.
Yeah.
Uh, it removed a lot of the guessing.
and to just add to what you said, when you mentioned Sebastian, I want to clarify for folks that we're talking about Sebastian Weber at Inside. I think over the 25 years of CycleSmart, there've been some really influential figures, that going all the way back to like the Janssen's lactate, pulse rate, heart rate book was big when we were first learning about coaching and before we had power meters. And then Paul Kirkley, who I bought my first SRM from in 2000, and was Greg LeMond's coach and famous Swiss coach. We learned so much from Kirkley, and so much of the CycleSmart like foundational methodology is based on what we learned from Kirkley. And I think since then, Sebastian Weber has really first time someone has both validated what we were doing in terms of giving us language to describe some things that we had already innately understood from experience, but didn't quite have terms for. And we'll get to that. But like one of the best examples is like we always talked about having crit legs, right? Where you knew your threshold power was low, but your ability to repeatedly change speed and feel comfortable in a criterium was a phenomenon that we observed over and over again, and even knew how to train, but didn't know how to describe. We didn't fully understand what was happening physiologically. And Sebastian gave us a name for that and a way to quantify it, and not just guess at it. So that was pretty significant for us, but also teach us some things. We adjusted some of our approach because we weren't getting it quite right, because we were so close to understanding, but weren't able to quantify it. So yeah, Al, you really summarized that really well for us.
Every time I do an inside test, I learn something. I think that's the thing I like about it. All the athletes, unless they're, repeat, athletes that are doing this test over and over and over again, you learn nutrition, you learn zones, you learn active
Psychology.
Yeah, it's a whole lot. Like, and I just love the way it gives you a report, and you have it, and you're like, this is it, and it's work. It is work to go and implement that, move zones around or whatever, but you can implement it for every style of athlete, and I like that.
Yeah, I think, Jordan, one of the things you quickly mentioned there that as I've been coaching more people doing gravel has been incredibly useful is like you said, the breakdown of nutrition and fat consumption versus carbohydrate consumption. That's been a really big thing, because one of the things you get out of this is that different powers, what is your primary fuel source and how much are you actually burning? Because gravel in particular, other disciplines too, taking in carbohydrates is probably the limiter.
Yeah.
That's probably the biggest thing that's limiting people from how fast they can go. Either they're under fueling, or they're trying to ride at an energy demand which is impossible to fuel for. And Inside really breaks that down effectively. It might say at 300 watts, you need 89 grams of carbohydrates to keep moving. And then you can build a fueling strategy. Of course, you're not going to fuel exactly 89 grams, but you're going to be able to build a fueling strategy that gets to that number. Maybe you know what you need to consume. Maybe you know what your limits are for a 4 or 5, 10-hour race, on what you can do in power and still take in enough fuel to keep moving.
Yeah, because part of what you get is combustion rates for
absolutely
unique to you, combustion rates unique to you for the power, and how those change for you relative to another athlete, but also how they change for you based on the effectiveness of your training. I think,
and you can move them around. Like, you can do multiple inside tests and see, okay, this is what we did. And maybe that gets into we're getting into talking about threshold or functional threshold, what are some of the problems with it is, but you can become fitter for the thing that you're trying to do and not have your threshold move or even have it move down. That's not necessarily a problem. And by doing something like Inside, you get to dive into that and see, okay, this number that we hold up as the Holy Grail sometimes, or that people like to hold up as a Holy Grail,
Yeah.
has decreased, but I'm actually better at what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, you
So
can turn those
we
switches.
are winning. Yeah.
Yeah,
Having I think the important points here, having a body of tests, the more tests you have over time tells you so much about the athlete. I think that was a big thing that we were able to do with Austin. I think we probably had 10 inside tests over the course of 2 years that really showed us the effectiveness of what we were trying to change in her fitness. But this idea that it's really important thing you said, Mike, and I know we will get to it when we talk about like the psychology of testing, but getting people to understand that the goal isn't just to have the highest 20-minute power you can possibly produce,
yeah,
and that how you can improve your performance in events by pushing your threshold power down. And that is so counterintuitive to people because, yeah, this is tied into why we don't like FTP, right? When FTP gets pushed to everybody and everybody thinks they have to raise their FTP to be competitive, then they get dropped on a 5-minute climb or on a 1-minute climb, or they can't follow the speed changes in a race. And they don't understand why their FTP is so high. It's like, well, yeah, that happened at the expense of these other systems that you need to actually race bikes.
yeah. It's race specificity and discipline, and I think
always,
people see that.
It's always a little funny when there's people at the finish line comparing power numbers, and you're like, well, you actually have the results sheet in front of you. You don't
Yeah.
need to compare
Yeah.
power numbers. We know what happened.
People
Like,
tell on themselves. Austin was trying to
yeah.
get in here.
Oh, well, to Jordan's point about how saying how he learns something from every test. I mean, I think that's the value of the data that Inside provides you. It doesn't give you a number. It gives you this like, metabolic footprint and profile, and then gives you a collection of power zones that are ranges. And I mean, I think it's like really liberatory for an athlete to further divorce themselves from chasing a number.
Yeah, and that those ranges are not based on percentage of threshold. Let's be clear about that because we might not have said it
Exactly.
explicitly. Those
Yeah.
ranges are based on your physiological profile, your metabolism at certain intensities. And different athletes who have different genetics and who have trained different ways will perform differently at different intensities. And that takes a while for athletes to get their head around that. Two riders with different physiological profiles, but the same threshold number will perform differently above threshold based on their physiological profile. Some riders can double their threshold and perform at that high level. Some riders can't make that power no matter how hard they try. They are not capable of producing the lactate and making the force and power to make power numbers that high. And think about the difference between a sprinter, pure sprinters and pure climbers and the way that they make power.
You could see who raced BMX as a kid too, especially when we see those. There's
let's
people
say
that
who
just
raced
did.
BMX successfully as a kid, right? Because someone could go on to be a world tour climber, but have started in BMX and found out quickly that maybe that wasn't for them.
100%. Yeah.
Let's finish this sort of testing overview, even though there was so much material in there already that's useful, by going a little bit backwards. And like, it would be strange to not talk about the Conconi test when we have a podcast about testing. And I'm sure there are plenty of people who are unfamiliar with it, who are new to the sport and who have never heard it because it has been generally abandoned. But when we started in the 90s, I mean, I think the 90s is the decade of the Conconi test. We were doing Conconi tests in the 90s, and eventually we got power meters. And the 2000s, maybe we abandoned that. But when we only had heart rate and ramp tests, and we were still discovering and learning, we relied on the Conconi test. And so I think Al and I are probably the only ones who are really experienced with it. And for those who are unfamiliar with it, the gist of it is a Conconi test is a ramp test where you're increasing some set amount of power, 20 watts or 40 watts, on a set schedule once a minute. I actually can't even remember the exact protocol anymore. It's been so long since I've looked at it, but let's just say some increment of power increase over some
Load.
Yeah.
I'd say load because sometimes it's at speed too. if it's
Yeah,
for
that's right.
running.
We didn't always have power to measure, right? Or you were doing it on
So
the track.
increase load every X minutes.
And track heart rate response as the load increases. And what you're looking for, or what we were looking for in a Conconi test, and what we believed in at the time, was this idea that when the load increased beyond capacity to sustain it, there would be a heart rate deflection point, a plateau in the heart rate response, and that you could capture that and measure it. And we believed in that. We did a lot of Conconi tests, and we felt confident that we were finding this deflection point. And Al, as we talked about a little before the call, I think there was a certain amount of reading tea leaves when we did Conconi tests, but also it mostly worked.
It was a reasonable test for what we knew, or what people knew at the time, without grabbing blood data or having a power meter. I think it was reasonable and accessible. It's because the heart rate is a decent proxy for oxygen consumption. So when you can add load, but you don't have your heart rate go up, that's a sign that we've already tapped out. So it gives you an idea. It's not precise in a way that we would think it is compared to the data we have now, but it gave us an idea.
Yeah, useful at the time. Best we had to work with at the time.
And if there was if the load was reasonably something you could replicate, then if you tested again and you got to a higher load at the same heart rate, you could track improvement.
That's right, for sure. That
So
is reliable. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You could just compare test to test and look at that and see hey, I prescribed this training and now they can get further into this, and you didn't know the composition. It's kind of cringy thinking about it now, but in the time it was reasonable.
Yeah. We certainly learned from it. I mean, it's foundational. We were able to go forward from that point. So, okay, we talked a little bit about zones based on percentage of threshold and zones based on metabolism. So if we're going to think about the broad, low-hanging fruit, easily accessible 20-minute test, we should talk about why it's been so widely adopted. Why does percentage of threshold sort of work for many people much of the time? And then we can talk about why it doesn't.
I mean, probably the exact same reasons, right? As you're taking an average cross-section of the average athlete, and saying, okay, this is what works for most people. I don't even know if I know them off the top of my head. Your tempo zone is 76 to 92% of threshold or whatever it is, and your threshold zone is 93 to 104. And it's it's not, these numbers aren't pulled out of nowhere. When these numbers were come up with, it's because this was the cross-section in average athlete. And it's really accessible, right? Yeah. It's accessible. You can do this quickly. It doesn't cost anything additional. You can do your CP test, or you can do your 20-minute test and pull that out. And like I said, it's not entirely inaccurate. You're getting a reasonable proxy of your training zones that might be enough to get you started.
We call it close enough, right?
It's definitely close enough.
Just riding in general, many people will get better. So getting better just by bycatch is not what we're looking for. And so I think that's kind of what it gets, is
not ruining.
Just ride lots. Yeah.
And I'll take that right into what's wrong with it, because so often the flip side of zones based on percentage of threshold is people do get ruined by it. And I think as CycleSmart coaches, we talk a lot about the unlearning we have to do with athletes when they come on. What are the habits that we have to break, or things that we have to break down for them? And this is one of the biggest ones, because folks are always chasing again, as we said, the highest 20-minute power they can, to try to set a really high FTP, which leads to, if they're not accounting for the anaerobic work capacity contribution, a 20-minute power, especially for sprinters. This is worse for sprinters. Sprinters can make a 20-minute power number that's much higher than their threshold compared to a slower twitch or more steady state inclined athlete. I know, Al, you might want to,
No,
yeah,
yeah,
you
I'd
want
say I
to,
disagree with
yeah.
that. Like, I think the most influential thing was when like Sebastian was telling us that like Tony Martin does his zone two at like 200 to 220 watts. So the people with the highest thresholds in the world are still, they're not doing that percentage of their threshold as zone two. Otherwise, those guys would be riding at like 300 or 350,
Yeah,
which
these
is,
aren't, I don't think that's a
that's
counter. I
why, yeah.
agree. Yeah, I agree completely. I think you can say these things separately. So the part of it that that stands out for me is the best example I think that comes up for me most is when I have a field sprinter who can make a huge 20-minute power number and then ends up with an inflated threshold number and then inflated zones based on that threshold number. And then they can't complete their training because they're trying to do that training based on percentages of a inflated number. That's the thing that I'm trying to, that's, let's say
I've
also,
never come across a field sprinter that puts out a big 20-minute power.
oh, I feel like that's pretty reasonable. Someone with a good short-term power can add to that 20-minute number and they maybe match someone uh, who has a true threshold power based on that 20-minute because their anaerobic capacity is a little bit smaller, so the numbers are closer. I think that overpacing shows up more in my experience for sprinters than it does for, I mean, let's for simplicity's sake, let's say sprinters versus climbers, you know?
I guess
Um,
maybe the point of this is to say it's so different from rider to rider that a percentage of zone, like you said, for Tony Martin, he could, if he took his percentage of what it should be for zone two, you're riding at a pace which is going to break you down because you can't fuel for it because it's muscularly really
too high
challenging.
for him as well
Mhm.
as a slower
Yeah.
twitch
And a
athlete, right?
sprinter might have a different looking power profile. It just falls apart when you have people, especially on the ends of the spectrum there. It's like
Yeah,
it's not, they
that's
aren't
a
the
good way to
average
put it.
anymore.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
And a
When
lot of times
riders,
world-class people are not the average. So
yeah.
what do you do with that? You can't base it off a percentage of threshold.
Yeah,
Yeah.
when people can't complete their workouts, it destroys them physically and mentally. And then
Yeah.
they're, it's just not the answer. I've
Yeah.
had, experience with people coming over, like, oh, I used to be able to do this, and then I started failing and this and that, and inaccurate zones are terrible for riders. For me,
Well,
I'd rather they be.
So
so don't you feel like this is one of the things that we do most that's so difficult is when we have athletes come on board, one of the most common things that we do is adjust their threshold numbers down. It's like the
And no one
first
likes that.
no,
Everybody
and
hates it.
it's and I think it's because we're fixing mistakes that they made before they came to us. But right away we're saying, hey, this is good news. I know this sounds like bad news, but the good news here is your threshold number is higher than it actually is. And this is why you've been struggling with these workouts. And we are going to make this adjustment down. And now all of a sudden they're completing their workouts, they're improving, and that number starts going up.
What's an
right,
ego
it's like
thing,
go
as we know,
go ride easier and get faster.
Yeah.
Like what's wrong with that?
It seems better
Bad for
all
your
around.
ego, which we're
Yeah.
gonna get
Yeah.
to, right? The ego is the thing that we're really testing. I feel like we're gonna get to that. Um, yeah, so let's take that right into like why then are metabolism based zones better? I think we've already answered it, but let's sum that up.
Well, you're going to set your zone to the metabolic process that you're trying to improve, which threshold is not that metric. So if I'm trying to improve something, tying it to a summation of many processes that aren't totally related that's like a lot of, kind of error to get to what we're looking for. So we're
Because
directly tying our zone to the metabolic process we're working on.
you said something that I think was really insightful that maybe hasn't hit me in the way that you just said it, but it's almost like you described like that 20-minute test or testing for threshold as being noisy because there's so many systems that go into figuring like making power for 20 minutes does consist of energy from lots of places. It's and maybe you could describe it as noisy, which is not a way that we've described it before, but is that a good
Yeah,
summary of what you
and
said?
noisy in different ways where like, so below threshold, like the sprinter is going to have a lot of problems, but above threshold, because, if you're a climber, you're at such a high percentage of VO2 that like you actually detonate much quicker. And that's something that was counterintuitive that like sprinters were a better above threshold because they still had a lot of aerobic capacity left. So how athletes act above threshold is very, very different, and how you would like prescribe intensity and the required time to recover from that intensity is going to be very, very individualized with a test like Inside.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, I think we can leave that there. That's a good, because we did hit on a little bit already, but that is a good way to pinpoint it. So I guess when we talk about testing generally, what is it that we're trying to pinpoint? So I had thrown out all the terms, anaerobic threshold, maximal lactate steady state, onset of blood lactate accumulation, LT1, LT2. We have some new terms in recent years: VLA max, fat max, carb max. So I think for us, we're going to talk about what we don't like about FTP. I left FTP off that list, right? So maybe I should, because I wanted it to have its own section, but let's just put it maybe on the list here so that we can also discuss it and why we don't like it and don't even like to say it. We don't even want it as a label. What are we testing for as a group of coaches? Cycle Smart, what are we interested in? I think I would say we like to talk about anaerobic threshold for those general all-purpose tests. The critical power test, where we're essentially, if we're setting zones based on threshold, the threshold we're setting zones based on is power at anaerobic threshold, which then you can say corresponds perhaps with maximal lactate steady state and onset of blood lactate accumulation. I would say when we're trying to keep it simple, that's what we're looking at. But when we're doing metabolic zones, I'll hand this over to someone else. What are the other things that we're looking for? What are we trying to figure out?
So
I
I'd say
guess
sorry, Mike. My testing philosophy would be like directly related to the athlete's goals, and I'm not going to use the same test for every athlete. So depending on what I need to improve or what the objectives are of the athlete, I will change what testing methodology I use. I just need whichever tool I pick needs to be reliable, repeatable, and something that's actionable with the results that come out of it. And so for certain people, I need to know a lot more. And so it all depends is really the answer. But I'd say like a max lactate steady state and their glycolytic fitness are very helpful. But then with like some other people, I'm looking for like what zone, like what's 2 millimole, and what do you do between 2 millimole and max lactate steady state?
Yeah,
Whether that happens at 4 or not, right? You're intentionally, I noticed like you didn't give me a number.
Well,
it can be different.
when I'm using lactate, I'll test for max lactate steady state. And that's the other like beauty of lactate is like you can just test in a training session. So like you can have so many more data points and that's kind of like that touches on the repeatable where you can like keep on checking in on your homework, where I don't love tests where like you test once and then like maybe you get back to it 2 or 3 months later. Like with lactate, I can test my prescription along the way to see if we're moving in the right direction.
Without a maximal effort test, like with not an exhaustive test. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's just I like that about lactate. The hard thing is, for me, testing and writing down what the numbers are. But I think that's the most attractive thing about it is it doesn't have to be an all-out effort. It doesn't bring ego into it for myself, and it also doesn't bring that crazy exhaustion rate of like a 5-minute all-out, or those things like that. Like it's more or less checking in and seeing what happens.
But to Al's point, if you have someone, I think say we coach lots of cross racers and lactate can be useful there. But if I'm coaching a cross racer, I probably also want to do an inside test because I want to see their VLA.
Yeah.
So to his point, what you're trying to change when we're doing a test, we want to set up the correct zones so that we can train. And then we also want to make sure that something comes out of that you can measure to make sure that you're changing the thing that you want to change, right? Mm-hmm. You want to identify what the thing you need to improve upon is, and then be able to actually track it. And then the simplest sense, that's probably the point of testing. It's not to have a higher threshold number. is to train better and then
Yeah,
track what
that's
you're
right.
changing with training.
Right.
That's
Yeah,
hitting
we're
the
gonna
nail
get
on the head right
That's
there.
gonna be in the end in the ego part. So it's so critical, and I'm glad that we keep hitting on it. I want to pull out. You mentioned VLA Max here, and I'd like someone to maybe talk to us about VLA Max, because that's new. Let's say recent. And when I talked about like crit legs and the ability to make repeated efforts, and things that we learned from inside, I think VLA Max is one of those biggest things. So I don't know if Al, you want to, maybe I'll assign this to you. Talk to us
It's
about
the
VLA Max.
so it's the peak rate of glycolytic activity. So it's our kind of, I'd say it's our anaerobic proxy. And so like, monitoring your kind of, how much like glycolytic activity and how much lactate you can produce, that's been our best bet for measuring how anaerobically fit an athlete is.
But now it's a thing that it took me a while to understand that this is a rate and not a direct
Not
measure.
a, yeah, it's not a capacity. It's not like a battery, which I think, Watt Prime and some of those other things more ascribed to.
Yeah.
And that's like, we saw that like that kind of capacity thing didn't hold up in training, testing, or racing. But the kind of a rate made a lot more sense with the kind of experience and data we had from our athletes. So that fit a lot more with our observations and what was actionable.
Yeah. And the combustion of lactate is part of the rate.
No, this is just like max production.
That's right. Yeah. So I want to make sure we clarify that.
Mhm.
That's one of the things that's changed our coaching approach and was really, or let's say a thing that allowed us to focus on it more and quantify it more in a way that we couldn't in the past. I think the other thing that I would say before we move on from like, we're sort of getting back to like why metabolic zones work and why we don't like FTP, is that the ability to perform at all of these different intensities isn't a consistent percentage from one athlete to another. We can't say that enough times, but VLA Max is one of the, say it's a zone, it's a rate that we can measure and train for. I don't know.
And that's as
Well,
coaches, that's the thing that we, when sometimes athletes start to plateau a little bit in their training where they feel like they aren't getting better. And this is where I'd counteract that and say, like, no, but we can change what you can do with what you have for the events you're targeting. And that's why it's so important.
And people really wanted FTP to be the silver bullet because it was simple and repeatable and accessible. And it tells you, I don't even want to say a lot. It tells you something, not everything, not enough. It's almost good enough, but it's so misused and relied on too much that it leads, I think we see, the main thing it leads to is overtraining and insecurity in the athlete.
Well, they're gamifying
And
to try to get that number higher, and that particular number is nice because it's one number.
Training to the test, trying
That's
to
what they're doing.
improve the test instead of your performance in bike races.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't hold space for the ebb and flow of how your fitness should change over the course of the year. I mean, the line shouldn't always be going up, and fixating on FTP is just chasing a higher number, making the line go up always. And it's like we need to shirk fitness, we need to shirk like threshold capacity at certain times for certain outcomes that we're chasing.
Yeah, we talk about the shape of an athlete's fitness a lot, I think, internally and with our athletes, and a way to get the athlete to understand that sometimes we intentionally push threshold down because we want to push VLA max up. The way you get them to understand that and buy into that in a way that doesn't hurt their feelings because their threshold power went down is that we're simply changing the shape of their fitness in order to get increased performance in the events that they're targeting. And that can be transformational for an athlete. I think for me, like Taylor Cook-White, like that was a huge focus for us this season. And we implemented a lot of new approaches with an athlete that I've been working with for years. And it was effective. It worked. We are seeing the performance, not just the power numbers, but the event performance that we were chasing by using these metabolic based zones and trying to shift a thing that she may not be genetically predisposed to. And we still improved it to the degree that she can perform in the events, the criteriums that she was targeting this year after seasons of focusing on the things. And Austin, I would put you in contrast to that, where like the things that you're focused on now have gone to the longest duration, lowest intensity work from, let's say, like the demands of cyclocross or road racing. And that's something that we wouldn't know from just a percentage of FTP.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the
Yeah.
interesting things with VLA was that, the most influential part of VLA movement is the negative things you do. So riding your zone 2 and 3 and probably too much sweet spot is the number one way to suppress it. So kind of like eliminating negative behaviors was the strongest way to improve certain aspects we were trying to improve versus adding a lot more high intensity. You can't like do enough high intensity to outride overriding your zones that trigger a moderate amount of VLA.
And that was a tough one, I think, at least for me as a coach, to get my head around, like, oh, I can't just assign these workouts. I have to remove these other workouts that are counter, even though they improve a thing that is important. It's like, at what cost to VLA? And if we're really focused on VLA, we've got to modify or pull these workouts out. That was an approach that we took with Taylor, and it was very successful and satisfying, validating to see it work.
More sophisticated testing certainly makes a lot more work for the coach, but it's worth it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think part of why we went in on the inside test was we wanted to do better work for the athletes. The athletes weren't aware of this or asking for it. We were like, gosh, this tells us so much more about what's happening with the athlete. That means we can do a better job, have more successful athletes, and just do better work.
It brings out much deeper conversations with my athletes, and they have a much more comprehensive understanding of why we're doing what we're doing. And then we're held accountable. Like, we have the prescription, then we retest, and like we have to see, like, here's what I prescribed to you. Did we move in that right direction? And like, if not, why? So it's like, there's a lot more accountability for the coach, but I think a lot more feedback in your prescription, whether it's working or not. I think, Mike, we've had that experience where like we tested and had things we were trying to move, and your system responded in a way that was unexpected. So we had to refine our prescription to get you where you wanted to. A lot more work for us, but very, very effective.
And it also, there's so much accountability, but like you said, on the coach's side, from the coach's side, but also from the athlete's side, is you start learning that, like, okay, if you want to say your goal is to increase your VLA, not only do you have to follow your zones when you're training, but the things you do outside of training actually really impact that as well. Are you fueling properly? Are you, what are you doing in the gym? Like, all of these things play into it. And those are just conversations that, without having this extra breadth of knowledge, we wouldn't be able to get to. And maybe as a coach or an athlete, you wouldn't be able to understand.
Yeah, explaining the why is always a big deal, to athletes, when they understand, like, why is my endurance zone lower? That was a hard one for me to understand for a while, and then it's not always being at the top end of that zone making PRs all the time. It's riding in the zone where you're going to get the adaptation that you want. And sometimes it feels like it's not the work you want to do, but they need that, and that conversation is super helpful. And it makes athletes, I know at least myself too, like you concentrate on that zone as much as you did when you were in threshold or you're in VO2. Like, you make sure you're in those zones. Don't
there's some of my clients are probably annoyed at me by now because I'd say ride your endurance easier so many times.
Everybody wants to go hard. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take a step back and talk about why, if we aren't able to do inside tests, or an athlete's not ready for the inside test, but we aren't using FTP, why do we like critical power? Why is our 5 and 20-minute test still robust and useful for us? What is it that we like about it?
It still takes some information from multiple different things, right? We're not just taking a percentage of FTP. We're saying, like, okay, this is your 5 and this is the drop off to the 20. That tells us a little bit more of the story. I think it can be really useful for certain athletes, either ones who don't have the capabilities or capacity, or even, inside isn't free, like even the extra money to spend on that, we can do a lot with that still.
Yeah, it has a little bit
getting
right.
people going.
That's right. It doesn't necessarily cost us anything to implement a CP test. I do think it's it's accessible. They're also like popular and common durations. Like, a lot of times when I want to simplify training, I really just think about it as like, what are the common durations that we go hard for? 15 seconds, 1 minute, 5 minute, 20 minute, 60 minute, 3 hours, 6 hours, like you can dumb
Three should be in there.
3
Three is
minutes.
the best three is the best proxy for VO2, so that should always be in there.
Yeah, you like 3 rather than 5. Yeah, yeah.
I think most of the scientific industry likes
Yeah.
3.
No, I didn't mean to leave it out. It's me agreeing with you. And we know when we do the inside test, that's been an important duration for the inside test. So I think the critical power test can kind of line up with that. They're accessible durations, even with the noted that like it can be hard to find a 20-minute stretch road, but also with the CP test, we think of it as a range, 3 to 5 minutes, 12 to 20 minutes. I always push people out to the longer duration because I think you're getting more data, more robust tests. Like a 3 and a 12-minute test sometimes I think can skew the results a little bit more. I like the 5 and 20-minute durations better for that. Yeah, so for us, compared to an FTP test, look, let's just do this other 5-minute interval and we don't have to guess. And I think we've made that clear already. And that's where you can really show an athlete like, hey, your 20-minute test was consistent, but your 5-minute power really increased. So your threshold number is lower, even though you made the same power for one test and more power for the other, and that makes you think, oh, I've improved. Well, guess what? You have improved. Your threshold power went down because you are using different energy systems to make that power. And now with that 5-minute power going up and the threshold going down, your performance will potentially improve in the events. You are more prepared for the events that you've been targeting as a result of this shift that we observed. That can take a while for athletes to get their head around, and you really have to help them understand how a threshold number going down can actually lead to increased performance. And that's not what you learn from an FTP test. There's no part of an FTP test that would reveal that to you or comfort you, let's say, when you watch that number go down. The idea that your FTP can go down, but your performance can go up is not included in the way an FTP test is implemented or described to the athlete. Let's take that into, I think, the ultimate point that we're trying to get to, and that's perceived exertion and ego management. And I want to talk about it in a couple different ways. I want to talk about PE in the sense of like pacing for testing and also pacing for training and calibrating your own sense of perceived exertion to be really in touch with how to train as an athlete and not to chase peak performances with every interval you do, and not to chase peak performances even with every test that you do. Getting comfortable with this idea that a test, like you said, a check-in, power check-in, or a test, how did you phrase it, Mike?
I think it's a power check-in. Yeah.
Power check-in. You have to get an athlete over this idea that a test is always a peak performance measurement and that it always should be higher than the last test that they did. We know that that's not true, but the athletes have a really hard time with that, especially when they're new. There are times that we test just to take a snapshot of where an athlete is so that we can set accurate zones for the next training block and make sure that they're paced correctly. And so I often refer to as like one of the main benefits of having a power meter is not to stare at a number and hold that number, but to calibrate your own sense of perceived exertion. Threshold should always feel a certain way, and you should get a similar heart rate response, but the power that you make at threshold can vary dramatically throughout the season. But threshold should always feel
it should dramatically.
That's right. Should as
I think if I have athletes where their power doesn't come down in parts of the year, that is not a good sign. Like they're too afraid to rest to get better. So like I definitely need to see that periodic function of fitness to see a continuous upward trend overall.
And so let me ask, what are your preferences for frequency of testing if we've established that we don't test just for peak performances, but to actually take the athlete's temperature. Excuse me. What do you prefer for frequency?
When there's been a noticeable change in fitness, I want to retest. If I don't expect that there's been any noticeable change, because I think through your daily training as the coach, you should see if there is data that is suggesting that you need to test. So I test when needed based on the data I have from training.
Yeah, frequency was with, like different blocks. I would want to test people, but then I saw some stress. People get the last thing I want to
Anxiety
do
around
is
testing.
stress. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I started moving towards what Al was saying is a little more like maybe after a big race block, in a recover we test, or definitely in the beginning of the season, that's always the one where you pop it on the schedule and you start seeing workouts being more and more completed, things being, nutrition dialed, things like that. It's kind of like a put it on there, and the athletes are like, oh, okay, this is the time to get serious here, so yeah.
I see that test anxiety often directly correlates to race day anxiety. So there's a very
Yes.
teachable moment in that. So my athletes that are not
100%.
engaged in testing or have like, bad days every time we test, that's a large conversation on the psychology of producing optimal performances. So another reason why testing, like especially harder testing, is a very teachable moment for athletes.
Yeah, I think when I have an athlete who's anxious about testing, I want to get them to the point where we can test frequently and that they can be dispassionate or not emotionally attached to the outcome, and maybe even excited to test because they want to find out where they're at despite what the news might be. So we talk a lot about being emotionally detached from the outcome.
Mhm.
It's just information that we need. I'm not expecting a peak performance necessarily, but I want to understand, hey, you just had a big break. Like we need to test. I test more in the winter, right? When there's less racing, there's more room to test, and you're seeing more linear improvement. If you're doing base in the winter, you're seeing threshold power going up on a pretty predictable, steady rate. And so that is often a nice place to test, even on a monthly basis. Like every recovery week could include a Saturday and Sunday power check-in to see what that progress
And
is.
that is the beauty of lactate testing. Is like you can just do that work and like you don't even have to you just check in, you grab a couple samples and like you get all the data you need from that.
Yeah.
So there is with lactate testing, the meter is much less than a pair of new shoes, and there's no interruption to training. So like there's no real excuse anymore not to have portable meters. But like with the kind of escalation of price in cycling, the lactate companies have forgot to increase the price of their meters. So like relative to the cost of cycling, lactate testing has gotten much more affordable.
Yeah, it's like the price of a new derailleur. And
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and so when we do that frequency of testing, it's good to talk about, and I think we've hit on that, but to reiterate, like the goals of the testing. And the goals of the testing are, not to expect peak performances, but to simply get an accurate snapshot of where that athlete is at any given point in time.
When I talk to my athletes about it, I say this is the numbers that you should be able to do after work, after, being with the kids, doing whatever, like regular life stuff. Like if you had an extraordinary day and you tested amazing, like that's great. But these are just your average numbers. You should be able to hit these. These should not be out of bounds for you at all. Because everybody wants to get ready and, do the test, and they're all, it's tough.
I think that ties into our like philosophy of not training to failure, and that training to failure or near failure frequently is counterproductive.
Yes.
So we're never really training to that breaking point where we're like going super high intensity, because it is, there's no research saying that it is beneficial to push yourself that hard.
That's right.
And with better metabolic data, you get to like optimize your dosage, and that's very far from failure. and something that you don't even remotely need to be at your best
Yeah.
to execute.
And so I think pacing and ego end up being connected here as in relation to both training and testing. And that what we want from an athlete is repeatability, and completability is the thing that I'll say. I want you to do this at a power that you can repeat it and you can complete it. If I think that you should be able to do some number of reps of an interval at a certain power, I want it to happen at the power that is effective but repeatable. I don't want every one of those intervals to be an opportunity for a PR. And I think this is a huge mistake that athletes make. And when they can't do that, or when they're attached to that, this is where their ego undermines them. I think one of the best indicators that you can have around the success of a workout is if those numbers are consistent. And I think for myself as an athlete, is probably the thing that I have that I think that I execute well and I'm proud of, and I'm able to demonstrate. I feel like, Al, you bring it up in calls often, like the repeatability of my work is based on 35 years of thinking about my perceived exertion and maybe thinking about, bike racing is about being uncomfortable. Can you make yourself uncomfortable and sustain it? And you really have to educate yourself about the flavors of discomfort, what they are telling you, how sustainable you are. Interval work should be meditative in that way. And so is testing, where you aren't checking out from the discomfort that you're in. You're marinating in it and thinking about it and contextualizing it and asking yourself, can I do a little bit more? Do I have to do a little bit less? You're a DJ or a producer just adjusting the dials slightly. But when
It's a
athletes,
very mature thing to be able to do that. I
well,
couldn't do that for the longest
are you
time.
calling me old?
Little bit, you're mature. No, but I know myself, whenever I first started, working, even with Jacob, I would overpace everything. And it was all about, I wanted those PRs. And, Strava and Zwift and Garmin, they're all telling you, like, hey, this is, you get a little trophy. I want a trophy after every interval, like that's
Right.
it.
Right.
And it takes a lot of self-control and things just to kind of say, no, I
Yeah.
need to pace this.
Yeah,
This
not
is
to. Oh, go ahead, Austin.
I mean, it's like developing the sense of perceived exertion is also so important for once you leave your static training environment that you're comfortable in. Like you can't train and perform at elevation unless you really understand what threshold, what VO2, what these zones feel like, because
Yeah.
the power and the heart rate, they're
Everything's
going to
lying to
diverge.
you. Yeah.
Exactly. All these data points are now not telling you what they were telling you when you were at sea level, or even in extreme heat. Like I feel like there's all these conditions that we don't necessarily get to set the terms of for where we race and train at times. And
to that point, a lot of times in races, you can't be staring down at your power meter.
You have to
To
respond to
pace
what's
how you're doing a
happening in
race.
the race.
Yeah, you need to be familiar with your perceived exertion, and you're not going to look down at your power meter and go, "Oh, I can't follow this."
Well, people
because
do
my power
that,
meter
right?
says
Yeah.
so. People do that,
Yeah.
but you can't do that. Like
Right.
you're never going to win a race. You need to understand, okay, this is how hard I'm going. This is what it feels like I have left. I actually think unless you're doing a time trial or like a 40-minute hill climb, power in races is mostly for analyzing after the fact.
Yeah,
Exactly.
not
100%.
you're
not
collecting the
using
data to
during.
look at later. Yeah. And
Yeah.
also I would say, as an athlete in a race who has to respond, I mean, now we're going to turn this into a podcast about race tactics, but let's try not to go too far down this road. But sometimes you have to try. Hey, the race is happening. Someone's attacking. It doesn't matter how I feel. It doesn't matter what the numbers say.
Got to go.
If I want to be in this race, I have to grit my teeth right now and cover this attack and hang on for dear life and ride over my limit. That is a whole other podcast, and actually one we probably should do. But I think ultimately what we're getting here is like, I mean, humorously, it's almost like the Buddhist approach to training, right?
Yeah.
That we're Zen in the art of exercise science. Like we are trying to take, what I've already described as like a meditative approach where you're really checked in with yourself during these intervals and monitoring your effort and calibrating your sense of perceived exertion so that you are familiar with the flavors of discomfort so that you can modulate them for effective testing and repeatable training.
I mean, I've joked it's like the Holy Trinity. It's, you know, perceived exertion, power, and heart rate. And if one of those things is extremely skewed, it's like, okay, let's check in what's going on here right
Yeah.
now.
That's right.
How do I have to modulate the effort
Right.
to
Right.
be,
It's
yeah.
yeah, it's an alarm. Why are one of these things out? And if you haven't calibrated your sense of perceived exertion, then you're not able to recognize when one of those factors is out of alignment. I think that's a great place to leave it. I think this went really well. I'm really happy with all the things we were able to touch on here. And yeah, that's a great place to wrap it up. So thanks, coaches. We'll get this up shortly. I guess if you're watching it, it's up. So thanks for tuning in. I hope it was useful. Wherever you're consuming it, we are always available for follow-up questions. So if it's YouTube, feel free to leave some comments and we'll try to answer those for you. If you're listening to this as a podcast, shoot us an email. And if you found what you heard today to be insightful, all of the coaches on this call, aside from me, are available to be hired as your coach, and would be glad to do so. And I suppose it goes without saying, cycle-smart.com for all of that info. Thanks, everyone.